Welcome to Beyond the Powerline Road, a podcast dedicated to bringing you inspirational stories. I want to talk about leadership today, and I want to start out with a young man that I had in a competition of mine, and he was first introduced to me as a sophomore. And in this particular competition, we have a team where you have the A students, and most of the A students are like the National Merit, the valedictorians, salutatorians, things like that. Then you have the B students, and then you have the C or lower grade students. And very often, I struggle trying to make certain that the C students, what I call the C students, keep their grades up, stay eligible for competition, keep out of trouble, that sort of thing. But in this particular year, what happened is I had a little bit of a problem with my A students. We were at a state competition. We were in a motel that had 14 stories on it, and all the stories looked down. You could look over the balcony and see this lovely pool of water down at the bottom. And the principal was there going to get pizza for the students, and I was in my room waiting. And I hear a knock at the door. And I open up the door, and here is the hotel manager with 3 students. And they weren't my C students, they were my 3A students. And I asked if there was a problem, and he said, "Oh, yes, there is." He said, "These students were throwing ice off of the balcony into the water below. And if they had hit somebody down there, it could have been a real problem." And I go, "Oh, yes, I totally agree with you." And the manager of the hotel was so mad, he said, "Confine them to their rooms, and if I see them out, they are kicked out of the motel." Well, that caused me a little concern. I called all 3 of their parents. I confined them to the room, and when the principal got there with the pizza, we just took the pizza to their rooms, and that's where they stayed for the night. Now, this young man was a sophomore, and it is kind of hard to know whether he was a leader or a follower at the time, but he was sort of on my list that particular year. He came back the next year, and much, much better. He was very involved. You can tell that sort of he was penitent of his silliness the year before. And the next year he came back as a senior, and he was so mature and such a great leader. I made him the team captain. In that particular year, with him as a team captain, I attributed our national win to him because truly he was inspiring to those students. And so what I can say is leadership in 3 short years, a big difference can be made. You can go from doing very lame things to very profound things. And I want you to remember that, because we're going to talk about church leadership and how people may not have been ideal at one time or another, but turn out to be some of the most excellent leaders that you can find. The first passage that I want to talk about is a leadership passage that is found in Jeremiah. And when I read this, you're going to question how inspirational this is at first, but I think you will follow along very quickly. Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 1. "Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the shepherds who care for my people, you have scattered my flocks and have driven them away, and you have not attended to them. Behold, I will attend to you for your evil deeds, declares the Lord. Then I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. I will set shepherds over them, who will care for them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing, declares the Lord." And continuing on, verse 5, it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, that I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute judgment and righteousness in the land." So there was a time, or there was a warning about shepherds in the Old Testament. And we're talking about not church leaders, we're talking about the leaders of Israel in the Old Testament, and were they scattering the flock? And in the promise, we see that Jesus will be the righteous branch, and that he shall reign as king, and in time he shall execute judgment and righteousness on the land. And we are waiting for that time. So there will be a final judgment, and until then, what we find out is that the churches need leaders. They need shepherds that can gather the flock together and comfort and teach the sheep. And there are many different names for the church leaders. If you look in different versions of the Bible, you will see the word elder, bishop, overseer, pastor, shepherd. I prefer the word elder, but that's basically because of my upbringing. There are some groups that prefer bishop or overseer, and there's one particular group. This is a group in Lubbock, which is the Sunset Church of Christ, that prefers the word shepherd. And that very big congregation, which has all sorts of different activities going and a lot of outreach programs, have 15 shepherds. Now I want to talk about someone that works for them, and I want you to see why shepherds on a local level are very important, or leaders on the local level are very important. There is a man that I know by the name of Rudy Ray, and Rudy Ray is involved with the International Studies Division of Sunset, and he works with Central American communities. And Rudy speaks Spanish very, very well. And I'm not going to do justice to his story, but I'm going to say it as best as I remember it. Rudy totally enthralled me a few years ago when he was talking about how the church could get into Cuba. And his story goes this way. Cuba had invited the Pope from the Catholic Church to come visit the people. And so the government of Cuba realized that there was a big influx of money because of this. And so they sort of were willing to open their doors to some missionary work. But at the same time, Cuba totally and completely distrusts the United States of America. And we know that there is a very, very lot of friction between the United States and Cuba, and we can understand it on both sides, distrust. So Cuba did not want anything that was organized to look like it was a centrally governed agency coming down to Cuba. So they were not interested in allowing the Southern Baptist or the Mormons or the United Methodist or the Missouri Synod or any of the organizations that have a central leadership to come down there. But Sunset, since it is a church in Lubbock with no ties to other church groups, and its leadership is simply a set of elders, was allowed to send missionaries into Cuba. And before COVID shut it down, they had missionaries coming and going, and they were doing a wonderful job of working with the Cuban people and converting Cubans. And so it was fabulous what was going on. And that is one good reason for churches to have elders and be autonomous one from another. I have gone and seen different churches where the autonomy is very, very important, because you can visit one church group and they have a certain set of rules and regulations. You go to a second church group and they may have an entirely different one, and one of those groups may fit your needs and your desires better than the other. I am going to give you 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. And in this, Peter is talking, and Peter is saying stuff that I have always been a little bit confused with, but I think I have the understanding of the verses. It says, "The elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also partaker of the glory that will be revealed, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers." So Peter, who is an apostle, which makes him a leader, sort of redefines the concept of elder as a church leader. And Peter obviously was probably more significant than some of the elders in the church, but Peter truly was considering himself as being just among the flock of shepherds. And he tells them, "Shepherd the flock which is among you, serving as overseers." And then he tells them what they need to do, not by compulsion, but willingly. Serve willingly, not because you have to. Not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. Be eager to serve. Not as being lords over those who are entrusted to you, but be examples. In other words, do not put your thumb down on the individuals of the flock, but serve as examples, as a good example, as a proper leader to those who need you. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. And that makes a whole lot of sense talking about elders. Now, here is why I was concerned about whether this was elders in the church or the elder people. You go to verse 5, it says, "Likewise, you younger people, submit yourself to the elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for the God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." So I was reading it as younger people and elder people. And in some sense, that also makes sense because of the fact that younger people in the church should be submissive to the elders. They should, let me say this, to the elder people, because they should know that those are individuals with experience. Those are individuals that have studied longer than they have, and they can be someone to learn from. They are a wealth of knowledge. So whether you interpret this as the elders of a church that are established as the leaders of this church, or whether you attribute it to the older population of the church, either way, the younger people need to be submissive. Now, the New Testament church is what we all try to emanate as we do our best to try to duplicate the New Testament church, because of the fact that we do not want to wind up being a church group that does not follow the guidelines of the first century. But we do differ from the church groups of the first century. And for one of those things, every church pretty much is a 501c3. And the 501c3 is because of the 16th Amendment, which has created the IRS and Internal Revenue Act, and then there's various updates and from revenue acts up to 1954, and it requires that a church has a bank account, that church have officers, that they must take minutes, and many of the duties of these church officers are not necessarily relevant to the scriptural growth of the church. So there will need to be officers, and those may not necessarily be the elders. Many church groups own property. Because of that, it requires maintenance and cleaning. It may require the officers to purchase insurance. None of these were issues with the first century church. So we do have to look at it and realize that there may be a leadership group that has to account for these sort of anomalies, if you will, compared to the first century church. But we still need spiritual leaders that rule by example. So for the next few verses, I am going to be comparing, or for the next few minutes, I'm going to be comparing 1 Timothy chapter 3 to Titus chapter 1. So I am going to read 1 Timothy chapter 3, dealing with elders. And if you remember, depending upon your version of the Bible, you may see the word elder, you may see the word bishop, you may see the word shepherd. And then I'm going to read Titus chapter 1, dealing with the same. And you will see different words there that are representing the same individual or individuals. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 3. Verse 1. This is a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, and one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. And moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Continuing with Titus, chapter 1, verse 5. For the reason I left you in Crete, remember Paul is talking to Titus, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I have commanded you. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination, for a bishop must be blameless, as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, holy, self-controlled, holding fast to the faithful word that he has been taught, that he may be able in sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. So Timothy and the book of Timothy and the book of Titus talks about church leadership, elders, and how they should be established and what a person should look for, a church group should look for when they establish these elders. And I am going to cover approximately 4. I will cover a lot of these traits, but I'm going to cover 4 that may be an issue in many church groups. The first one, a bishop must be blameless. Or if you go to the Titus version, a man is blameless, if a man is blameless. What happens is free of blame or free of guilt is the definition of blameless, free of guilt or innocent. And you think about it and you wonder, well, how can anybody be innocent? Because we are all sinners. And we are all sinners, but we are all covered by the blood of Christ. And what happens is we cannot hold someone accountable for things that they may have done in the past. And I want to bring up that young man that I talked about at the beginning of the lesson. In a matter of 3 short years, that young man went from doing something devious and almost getting us kicked out of the motel to being one of the best leaders I've ever had. If I were to continue to blame him for something that happened 3 years before, I would have never seen him grow to be the young man that he is now. So we cannot look back at the past too far. Now, we could go back a couple of weeks, we can maybe even go back a year, but if you start digging down and going back 3 or 4 years to find something to blame someone for, it's not that individual that's at fault, but it may be you that's at fault. The second one that turns into be a issue with many church groups is the husband of one wife. And there are a whole lot of different thoughts on this one, and I had stumbled across a website. It's at gotquestions.org, and it says husband, one wife, HTML. So it's a website that talks about this, and it says there are 3 possible interpretations, and I'm going to paraphrase the website. One of them simply says that the man cannot be a polygamist. Well, that makes sense. But during Paul's time, polygamy was very rare. Then the Greek version of husband and one wife is basically translated as one woman man. In other words, that individual needs to be fully and loyal to his wife. And so we're looking at a moral purity there. And the third phrase that they talk about is that an elder can only have been married once. And then they go on and they say, other than the case of a remarried widow, or in other words, a pastor cannot be a divorcee. And this brings up some questions because of the fact that I have seen on two different occasions. One occasion, a friend of mine that preaches in Fredericksburg, his wife left him. She left him, ran off with another individual. He was left with 3 boys to raise. And a few years later, he wound up finding a soulmate and marrying her. And she helped raise his children. And he is an elder up there in Fredericksburg. I know of another instance where a church that we had attended, there was about 4 elders. And this one we knew from when we had home church with him. And he was an elder, but he had been divorced before he became a Christian. And so when we are dealing with elders and divorce, because divorce is kind of rampant in our society, the church groups need to figure out what their expectations are. I cannot say anymore that a elder cannot have been a divorcee. I just think that it's something that the churches have to look at, because there will be individuals that will question it if an elder is a divorcee. So one of those things that is a kind of a hot topic, and one of those where the church group needs to get together and make the decision before they start appointing elders. And then there are a whole lot of other things: temperate, sober-minded, good behavior, hospitable, not given to wine, not violent, etc. And if I were to cross-reference these between 1 Timothy and Titus, I would see that many of these are word for word the same, or very, very similar from one book to the next. There are a couple things in 1 Timothy and there's a couple things in Titus which I think need to be addressed. One in 1 Timothy is he must have a good testimony among those who are outside. In other words, he must be considered to be a good person by those individuals that he deals with, by city leaders, by neighbors, stuff like that. In other words, he should not be thought of as negatively by individuals outside the church. And there is the other one that I think is always questionable in Titus, and I think people have a hard time with it because they don't fully understand the word, is the word comes up as holy. So in reference to holy, I'd like to go to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13. And Peter here is talking in verse 13 about how to be prepared to be a Christian. And he goes, therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, as obedient children, not conforming yourself to the former lust as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, ye also be holy in your conduct. Because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. So as we attempt to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, even though we may fall off that path from time to time, as long as we are changing our ways, and as long as we have repented and are not drawn to our former lusts, we can be considered as holy. And then the very last one of those four, or of the four that I was going to mention, is the one about rules his household well, having his children in submission with reverence. Or if you go to Titus, having faithful children, not accused of disputation or insubordination. Children need to obey their parents, and that makes sense. I know a man that became a Christian in his 50s, and in his 60s, the church wanted to make him an elder, and he refused to be considered. And the reason he refused to be considered is because he said he had a wayward child. And that wayward child, the interesting thing about it, is it had been married, divorced, and remarried before that man became a Christian. So how long do we look into a person's life to see whether that child is submissive and not disrespectful? So in that particular case, I think his excuse was one that he truly believed in, but I'm not certain the church would have held him accountable for. When we look for elders, and we look for elders for an office, and we look at the overseers, few things that I want you to have a good feel for. Don't dwell on who they used to be. Because before the cleansing blood of Christ, all of us were destined for hell. Don't expect them to be perfect. Perfection comes later after our life. We just try to strive for perfection as we live day to day. When individuals are being considered, those individuals need to learn to forgive themselves, because God has already forgiven them. And then those individuals also need to know that an eldership is not a life sentence. They can commit to a time interval. My brother was an elder at one time, and if I recall, he committed to a 3-year time interval. And when the 3 years were up, he decided that it was time for someone else to take his place, and there was something like 3 or 4 elders in that church group. So it was very easy for them to continue on because there was a multiplicity of elders. And when a church goes to selecting an elder, this is something that I strongly believe in, but there is no scriptural background for it except for what I have seen in my past. Do not put a preacher in a position of being his own employer. In other words, if you have a paid preacher, that individual should not be an overseer. And because the overseers need to oversee the preaching. Don't guilt trip an individual into considering being an elder. And do not look at just the old ones, because some of the middle-aged and younger may have a whole lot of maturity when it comes to understanding the Bible and what is expected. Let your expectations be realistic of these individuals. And as the church grows, expect a rotation of elders. Maybe expect adding elders, maybe expecting seeing elders rotate in and out of their job every few years. I want to mention a quote that I really like, and it also allows me to change subjects slightly. Benjamin Franklin said, "The moral and religious system which Jesus Christ transmitted to us is the best the world has ever seen or can see." Ben Franklin was a deist. He did not believe in the structure of the churches around him at the time, and I don't know which churches those were without going into further research, but he was a man of faith. He believed what Jesus Christ had taught him. And if you read into what he says, you know, the religious system that Jesus Christ transmitted to us as best as the world can see and ever see, you kind of understand where Ben Franklin and the founding fathers chose the constitutional republic that they came up with. And why did they choose a constitutional republic? Because of the fact that an eldership is a representative leadership, or I'm going to put it a little differently, an eldership is a representative government. Spiritual government, but government. And I'm going to go to a quote that I got from a New American magazine, and it has to do with the constitutional republic, and I'm going to do this because I want to talk about preachers. Here's the story. The deliberation of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was held in strict secrecy. Consequently, anxious citizens gathered outside Independence Hall when the proceedings ended in order to learn what had been produced behind closed doors. The answer was provided immediately. A Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" Without hesitation whatsoever, Franklin responded, "A republic if you can keep it." Now, our constitutional republic has been degenerating into a democracy over the period of years, especially since the 17th Amendment, which was the popular vote allowing senators to be selected by vote rather than be selected by a governor. And as it continues on, the majority rule will wind up ultimately possibly going to mob rule. And we've seen that in the last few recent years, to where to this particular date, I don't know what kind of government we truly have, because it is somewhat questionable. It's definitely not a constitutional republic anymore, and we want to probably get back to that. Now, why am I talking about constitutional republic? Because preachers coming out of preaching school want to know who they need to answer to. And so I have a list of different groups or congregations that need preachers. And in both of these cases, I have Tennessee here. And in both cases, the attendance of these two church groups are 100 individuals. And it says 100 individuals for the attendance. The first one, 0 elders. The second one, 4 elders. If a young preacher comes out of preaching school, he looks at that first job opportunity and realizes that he has 100 employers. Why does he have 100 employers? Because of the fact that there's no elders there. So he basically is walking into a democracy. Now, maybe they have limited it to a leadership group or whatever, but just by the looks of the employment posting, it appears to have 100 employers. If he goes to the second group, where there's an attendance of 104 elders, he knows he's responsible to those 4 elders. Those 4 elders will be leaders of the congregation. The congregation set up the elders to be their leaders, and the elders will be the ones calling the shots for that particular preacher. So it is wise to have elders established if you want to have a full-time preacher. And keep in mind that a full-time preacher does not have to be a paid preacher, in which case that non-paid individual may be an elder. But as long as you are employing a preacher, they should not be in a situation of being an elder. I've said that before, and that is my thought. That is not necessarily scripture. And if I sum this up and go to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, keep in mind when we are talking about elders, when we're looking at 1 Timothy, and when we are looking at Titus, all scripture is breathed out of God and is profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped in every good work. May the God of peace be with you all. Have a good day.